thank you for joining me today. Today is week 2 in our series on reviews. And today we're going to be talking about beyond systematic reviews, other types of reviews. So I'm Emily Newberry. I am the research and scholarship librarian here. So I am available to support you if you're working on one of these review projects. Feel free to get a hold of me. My contact info will be at the end of the presentation. So this is just an overview of the series that we've been doing. So the first session was kind of introducing us to what a systematic review is and seeing why you might want to do one. Unfortunately, I was ill last week, so we had to reschedule. So thank you for joining me today. This is the second week, beyond systematic reviews, other types of reviews. So we'll be talking about those today. And then the next 3 sessions are all going to be sort of breaking down the process into 3 different areas, and we'll kind of go through the entire process of doing a review. Just one note, we had to shift the dates because of me being out last week. So the very last session was to be scheduled on October 20th, but we had to bump that because we actually had a pre-existing schedule. So that we had a presentation for Deep Blue repositories scheduled. And that's going to be on October 20th at the exact same time at noon. So I do recommend joining us if you can, because data management is a huge part of doing one of these. You need to make sure that your data, your documents, all of your things for your review are stored and available for other researchers, et cetera. So these repositories can really be useful. It's U of M's institutional repository. So you can read a little bit about that, but you can register on Campus Connections, the way you registered for this, for that presentation. So our agenda for today, there's quite a bit on here. We're going to go over how to know what review might be the right one. There's, the family reviews. There's a bunch of reviews out there that you may or may not be familiar with. And then one of the articles that I really like, they identify 14 methodologies, and we're going to go overview that, but then we're going to go into depth on 9 of them that I think you'll most likely encounter. So that takes us through to 13, and then we'll wrap up at the end, and then we'll do some Q&A. So I think the session probably will run about a half an hour, and then we'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end. And then if you have any questions, Liz Svoboda is here with me, my colleague. She will be monitoring chat, so feel free to pop those in. We can answer them at the end. So let's just jump into what we're here for. So systematic reviews, as we talked about last session, they are for a very specific purpose, right? If you have a very specific question that you have and you have a PICO type question, it's really great for those types of things, but there's lots of other research that doesn't require that kind of review. It's a little bit too much. It's, if you have a small team, if you have a short time frame, it's not appropriate. And if you have a non-PICO research question, so something where you're, examining interventions, it may not be the right time for you. Additionally, if your research is broad, let's say you're trying to look at the landscape of something, or if you're trying to figure out, what the literature is saying, if there's gaps in the literature, or like I said, if you don't have a narrowly defined PICO question, there's lots of other types of reviews that may be better, and they're becoming more and more valued as parts of the published literature. So some methodologies are more described than others, and we'll kind of get into that. But each one of these adds a valuable piece to the body of literature in whatever area you're trying to add your insights into. So these are my 2 favorite articles. We have these in our collection. The first one is a newer one, Meeting the Review Family, Exploring Review Types and Associated Information Retrieval Requirements. And then this other one, Typology of Reviews, an Analysis of 14 Review Types. This is the one I'm going to be going over in more detail today and kind of summarizing that article, because they do a really nice job of breaking down those types and describing them. But I do want to show you, I can get this to open up here. Let me know. Okay, can you see the article on your screen?
We can. Emily, can you enlarge it a little bit, because it's a little bit hard to read?
Definitely. So this, I'm just going to show you really briefly, this particular article does a great job of kind of going through all the different review types and breaking them down into families. So as you can see here, I'm going to show you, there's just a ton of different sub kinds of reviews. It's like in a traditional review family, systematic review family, overview. You can see rapid reviews. This article kind of goes through and breaks down even the sub sorts of studies that are starting to become more popular. So this is a great article if you want to kind of see those. But today I am going to focus, as I said, I'm looking at both of my screens here, on Grant and Booth's 14 methodologies. So that article from, let me go back here, from 2009, it's a little bit older, but it does a really great job of kind of breaking down those articles that, or those types of research methodologies for reviews. So there's 14 listed here, you can read them, but I'm going to be focusing on the ones that are highlighted in yellow because those are the ones that I think either people don't understand as much or you'll encounter more often. So give you a minute here to take a look at those. Okay, so then we're going to just jump in and talk about each one of these. So mapping reviews is a kind of review that it's used to sort of look at what's out there, right? To see what's out in the literature and to categorize it. And it's usually on a very narrow topic. And they usually don't stand on their own. They're usually something that's done in order to assist people with doing other reviews or to sort of help people see the bodies of literature out there. And they're very popular with policymakers because they can look and see, where the research is for them to, really make good policy. The strengths of these is that it allows for those identification of the gaps in the literature. You can see, you can see where people are doing research and where people aren't. And it can really contextualize all that information that's out there. And you can kind of justify, conducting a full systematic review if you see there's a large body of literature in a certain area. The weaknesses, some people criticize it for saying that it can oversimplify an overall picture. And a lack of quality assessment means that there may be articles in there that may not be as high quality because it doesn't have that rigor of a more comprehensive review type. Because these are so, I don't want to say strange, but they're different. They're usually in a graphical format. I'm going to show you just a couple of examples. So give me 1 second here. Can these up? Opening up on my other screen, sorry. So this is one, Women in Wage Labor. This is from the University of Northampton in the UK. But you can see here, it kind of shows by these bubbles, the size of, so like employment status, social security, kind of gives you a graphic overview of where these bodies of literature are larger, smaller, absent. Let me open up another one here. So this is one on the acceptability and uptake of vaccines. So you can see here, if I click, for example, on hepatitis, it kind of shows, based on these little squares in this one, it shows age ranges. So you can see these are graphic ways you can just kind of pop in here and see, oh, okay, the literature is present in these areas. And it can be super, super helpful. And finally, I'm going to show you this one. This is a living systematic map. This is not the right one. Sorry. Here it is. So this is a COVID-19 living map of the evidence. So as we know, COVID-19 literature is, being published more and more and more. So this particular living map of the evidence is continually updated by the Epicenter. And so we can see, oops. And it's not going to cooperate with me right now, but you can kind of see how this should be organized, and you can see visually all these things. So these are a really cool way to get information in a more visual way to help people kind of jump into those areas that need more research. Okay, meta-analysis. So you've probably heard of meta-analyses. So the point of these is to go beyond that systematic review where you're, textually looking at the statistics and discussing the findings. This is going to have you actually synthesize those findings in order to give a more precise idea of what the results are from an intervention. It does require, though, however, that when you look at the studies that you'd like to include, they have to be similar. If they, are looking at the same outcomes, measurements, populations, that's good. But if they're not, you can't really combine those in any meaningful way. So we know this pyramid here, and I'm sorry these are so dim on here, but so meta-analysis is at the very, very top of the pyramid, even before, even higher than systematic reviews, because that numerical analysis really does reduce the bias even further than a systematic review. And then most of the other reviews that we're going to look at are still above that line for the filtered information. So these are all going to sort of be in this evidence synthesis and guidelines. So we're still, up above that line where these are all really great evidence. But yeah, meta-analysis kind of sits at the top of that pyramid. So the strengths of meta-analysis, obviously, are when you're using the statistics, it's going to show more precise effects of interventions. And it also allows for you to compile studies. Sometimes you might find some really small, underpowered studies that on their own don't give good evidence. But when you're able to statistically weight them and combine them with other studies, it can bring them into the overall findings and make them more useful than they would be on their own. One of the risks that people talk about is the risk of combining apples and oranges, but that's sort of on the researchers. Hopefully things like that are published with poor methodologies where they're combining those, but metasyntheses are only as good as the included studies, and the studies that you find are really going to make or break a meta-analysis. Okay, qualitative review, qualitative evidence synthesis. So these essentially are along the lines of systematic review, but it's using qualitative data instead. And since it's using qualitative data, you're going to end up finding some more of that like contextual information. It's going to look at trends, it's going to look at themes, it's going to look at things like that rather than answering very specific questions. And one of the things that kind of happened early on with this is that a lot of people would call systematic reviews that didn't have meta-analyses, which is a lot of the systematic reviews. They would call these qualitative reviews. So Cochrane collaboration actually prefers the term qualitative evidence synthesis, so as to sort of separate those out so that you understand that a qualitative evidence synthesis is where you are just using qualitative data to kind of remove that confusion that it's a systematic review. So hopefully that makes sense. And the strengths of these are that it does examine, topics where you're looking at attitudes or beliefs, or where you want to see, where you want to see if there's barriers, if you want to see how users feel about the interventions. Qualitative review can be really great in that area. Its weakness is that it's not as well defined as some of the other review types. So the methodology isn't as strong because you are combining, textual information, and it's not as clear cut as when you're working with numerical data. Oops. The next review is a mixed methods review. So what this is essentially, it's a systematic review. It's going to have that systematic review component, but it's a way to also add some qualitative data that will allow, the reader to be able to see some of that attitude information or beliefs along with the numerical data. So if an intervention was done, a mixed methods review can kind of show you how people felt about that intervention as well. So the strength in this, obviously, is that it's going to add additional content, or context, I mean. So for the people who are reading this, not only will they see that an intervention worked or didn't work, but they can see how the users feel about that. So if it's an intervention that works, but there's barriers to uptake or patients just don't like it, this can really be a good way to sort of convey those findings. There can be methodological challenges, though, of bringing together and integrating findings from different studies because they may have different structures originally, perspectives. So there can be challenges making sure that that's, a rigorous methodology. Rapid reviews. Rapid reviews are a great way to abbreviate systematic review. So sometimes, people want the evidence, let's say for practice, and they don't have a year and a half to go through the entire systematic review process, but they still want to have a well-researched project that will show findings in order to make decisions. And so these are becoming more and more popular, and it allows policymakers to kind of see quickly, what's going on so that they can make more rapid decisions. And they use aspects of systematic reviews, but they'll cut out something, different pieces of it. So it could be limiting to like 1 or 2 databases rather than 6. It could be doing a much more narrow search, so the number of results you get are smaller, removing gray literature, so any of those articles that weren't published in scholarly journal. So there's different ways to cut it down. The point of a rapid review, though, is to be explicit. So you're cutting down the steps, but you're also explicitly stating what you did so that any bias that's introduced can be acknowledged. And so the strengths, obviously, is that it does retain the rigor of a systematic review, but it's so much quicker. So a lot of people, sorry. A lot of people like that as far as, decision making. By removing steps, obviously, though, you can introduce bias. So, you can introduce publication bias by only using published data. Those sorts of things happen, and you may end up using lower quality studies because that's all you found in the 2 databases. So there are some weaknesses to it. But again, with any of these reviews, as long as you're explicit about understanding and writing out how you shorten the process or what biases you may be introducing, that's the main point of this, is that the readers understand what you did and can replicate it and understand that there may be biases in these. So scoping review, this is one you've probably heard of. Scoping reviews are very popular as well. And the point of these is to provide an initial assessment for all the literature that's available on a topic before you would conduct a full systematic review, or in order to find out if you should conduct a full systematic review. So it's going to answer questions, what's available. It's not going to answer specific research questions that you want to synthesize and answer. This is more just to kind of see what's out there and what's out there says. So the strengths of a scoping review are that they do share all the hallmarks of a systematic review. These should not be, in the article, the Grant and Booth article says quick but not dirty. You do need to do, the hallmarks of that. You need to be, have a time commitment, have a full team, and you do need to provide an exhaustive search of the literature in order to have it, be fully scoping. The one thing about scoping reviews, it's generally not the end of a project. It's generally a preliminary stage. And once you find out what is out there through a scoping review, then you'll end up doing a full systematic review. Although scoping reviews are published, so you can get these published. But again, they're sort of meant to be the step before you do a full systematic review. State-of-the-art reviews. This is a newer one that I've just sort of become familiar with. And these are really nice for historical topics. So like if you're interested in why something has become the the preferred intervention, or if you're interested in the history of use of a certain, procedure or medical tool or something like that. And even in social sciences, you can see like, why did we get to this point? So again, these are sort of used as an initial examination of the literature to give you background or to give the reader background on this area before you might do a full systematic review. And then the strengths on these are that they do provide the historical trajectory of a concept. So you can see again how we got to where we are from where we started. And as readers, these can be really great for readers to get a full view of the landscape without having to dig in and find all these different articles. So they can be really great overviews for people who are new to a certain field. because it's an abbreviated form and an abbreviated methodology, you are going to have, some of those issues with bias. And this is much more open to interpretation by the author because they're the ones sort of drawing together the findings to explain that trajectory. Another issue is sometimes, and I'm going to use an example of hand washing. Sometimes topics sort of just become really, really overdone in the literature. Like if you look for hand washing in the United States, we've known hand washing is good for a long time. So that's not really in the literature anymore, right? So if you're looking in a time-based, for like a time-limited group of articles, you may miss certain research because it was outside of that group, and time limitations usually are a hallmark of some of these, quicker, more abbreviated reviews as well. So just you need to make sure that, if you're looking at something that used to be written about, that you either include that in your review or don't miss out on it because it's not being written about anymore. So systematized reviews. So this, when you first glance at it, it may look like it's saying systematic review, but it's systematized reviews. These are a very abbreviated review type that basically it's just a literature review, but it incorporates systematized steps. So this can help familiarize either new researchers or students to the process without having them do a full-blown systematic review. So these are really ideal for student projects because they can be done with very few resources, and one or two students can work on one together, and the time frame is very short, like a rapid review. So this is a really great way to bring students into this kind of research without having them commit to something much, much larger. So as I said, it can be used, to orient researchers. The weakness, though, is that quality assessments are generally absent in reduced, and the output obviously may contain bias. So a lot of times these aren't necessarily publishable. They could be if they're really well done and well documented, but generally speaking, it's sort of a way for people to become familiar with these processes. And then an umbrella review. So an umbrella review is sort of a newer kind of review as well, with the, huge growth in published systematic reviews. Now you might be able to, on a topic, find more than one systematic review and use those to look together to become, to get an even bigger picture view of something in an area. So I think some people also call them big picture reviews, things like that. But these are usually going to focus on more broad issues just because really you don't want to have duplicative systematic reviews in the literature. So if you have things that are common but not overlapping, you can use them for an umbrella review. So I keep covering the strengths a little bit ahead of time, but that's the strengths. You get a big picture review of available research. The weaknesses are, though, some topics may just not have those systematic reviews that you can draw from. They may only have one or two that aren't, easily integrated. But if you can find more than one, obviously 2 or 3 or more articles that are similar, that can give you a picture, this can be a way that you can help give an even larger idea of where things are. And this wasn't on the thing, but this is a bonus review type. This is something I've just learned about, and I'm actually collaborating on one right now. It's called an empty review. So occasionally when you start your project, you come up with the whole protocol, the whole plan to do a systematic review, a scoping review, some kind of review. And then once you actually go in and do all the research, as long as your search wasn't too narrow, you have kind of look to make sure that your search was appropriate. But if your search was appropriate and you're not finding anything, it means that you've found a gap in the literature, and you can write what's called an empty review to explain that. And these are becoming more popular, and some journals are publishing them because it does highlight and explain why certain areas should be studied if they're not currently being studied in the literature. So just some considerations before we move on to the Q&A. Selecting the correct review That can be hard because depending on your topic, sometimes even the people that I've know and trained with who've done this for years and years have a hard time figuring out whether a scoping review or a systematic review would be better. So always, feel free to reach out to a librarian or an information specialist, and we can kind of help you maybe see if one methodology is better than another. Many of these are meant to be preliminaries, right? They're meant to be done before and to help prepare you for doing a full systematic review. And another thing is, if you'd like to have one of these published, you should really kind of do some research ahead of time to see if these are being published and if they're being published in your discipline. So certain of these types are popular in certain disciplines, and other ones may not be. So check your journals that are in your field to see if you're seeing these, and also check the journal pages themselves to see if it's something that they actively collect. And then last night I decided to start making a resource, which is not ready for today, but I will show you it real quick. It's just going to be a supplemental resource list with some resources as to each one of these kinds of methodologies, and then some good examples. So I am going to finish creating this, and then when the slides are ready, I will send out this as well for you to look at, because there's so many great resources out there and it can be hard kind of to figure out where they are. So I will do that and get back with you with that. And with that, that's the end of this presentation. So I am happy to take questions. And I'm going to stop sharing.
First of all, I have not heard of all of these types of reviews. So is it I mean, like I've heard of course, a meta-analysis, scoping review, but I haven't heard of many of the other names. I don't know if it's just my journals that I frequently read, but they don't seem to identify these other types. And they don't always identify if it's a full systematic review. They do usually if it's a meta-analysis. But how familiar are people with these terms and types of reviews? Because much of this was new to me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, Kathy. That's good to know. And it is a problem. It's a big problem in the literature. There are a lot of reviews that are published as systematic review, with that even in the title, and they're not systematic reviews. And so that is becoming, and I think that's why there's been this effort to sort of start to branch these out and to get people to name them more appropriately. So you're right. And also some of these like state-of-the-art reviews, I think, are becoming more popular in social sciences, education. So you may not see that as much in, physical therapy or in some of the health. So there may be some of these, types that, and I'm still trying to suss that out on my own too, like where these kind of tend to live more. But yeah, I think that's a big problem, that people are doing these things, calling them systematic reviews or just calling them a review, right? And so that's why these articles in particular are trying to get, that. So if you go into any database and you type in like, rapid review, you'll find some, but a lot of times, yeah, they're not identified. And that's another reason I think why the databases can't do like filtering, because usually they'll kind of, if they can, add a filter for something, so you can say, look, I only want systematic reviews. But just because the methodologies are so murky, I think it's more and more important for people like me and to help to inform all you guys. So yeah, if you have questions, Kathy, and you're like, oh, that actually sounds like a cool methodology, we can look at it and see if it's being done in PT or in your interdisciplinary groups, and whether that's
yeah.
Well, because again, the journals even themselves may not even say that, but if you reach out, they may say, oh yeah, we'd love to publish a a scoping review or whatever.
Yeah, and like if I'm going to look at systematic reviews, labeled systematic reviews, more critically, because they could be a rapid review. But I mean, they always have that, we looked at this many, we inclusion, exclusion, and we excluded these, and they always have that figure. But sometimes you don't know, like they're supposed to put the criteria in, but I don't know if I didn't know there were all these different types to know if I was thinking they were all held to the same standard of rigor.
Yeah, they're not. And that's the thing. And that
Yeah.
is the challenge. And so like naming them appropriately, I think can help to eliminate some of that confusion, because yeah, I mean, they should all have elements, right, of
Right.
systematic review, but it differs in which elements that they use and critical appraisal and all that. So yeah, I think, looking through the methods on a lot of these, you'll probably start to see that a lot of them really aren't systematic reviews. There's some other kind of review. They're not answering a PICO question or like a PCC question, laid out in that way. Then it's not going to be a systematic review. So that's a great question, because it really is. It's confusing, it's murky, and that's why I really love those two articles. And I when I send out the slides, you can see that. And actually, Kathy, I can probably just send you the two articles. I have them in my folder, but
Yeah,
they're
I'll
really
take
good for
I'll take a look at
understanding
both of the articles. I do have another question.
Mhm.
I don't see anybody else here, so I guess I'll just ask my last question. I don't understand how you can do a mixed methods review, because I'm more quantitative, but I've done a little bit of qualitative work and tried to identify themes, etc. But oftentimes when you're doing mixed methods, you might be putting together your own survey or your own questions to ask in, a small group session or something. So I don't know how you can compare mixed methods research as a review. I don't know how to.
I haven't worked with these, just but from what I've read on these, it's essentially like the best, I think, way to do it. Because yeah, you can't, that's one of the challenges of that methodology. You can't just like mash them together, right? But if you do the systematic review like piece of it, and then you can say, as more, and again, with all these methodologies, being explicit in your write-ups is important. So to say, we did our own research through a survey to see how people felt about X and X treatment, and you sort of treat that as like contextual, information, but you can't necessarily say, obviously, like everybody across the world loves this treatment. So it is very, and that is one of the I'm not sure how great, and this is another piece I need to look into, find like a really good mixed methods review that people like, that are, they say this is a really good one. Because yeah, that is, and everything I've read, it is a challenge of those mixed method reviews. But I think with a lot of these reviews, it's starting to be not just a tool for caregivers or for providers, but for politicians and policymakers, who want to see a quick, so it's sort of on us to make sure that what they're seeing is good, right? But they want it like now. And so having something like that where they can say, oh, people are really like this, or people don't like this, for the policymakers, they like that because that gives them a one-page sort of, but yeah, exactly like what you said.
Well, this was informative, so thank you.
I'm glad, Kathy, and thank you for coming. And yeah, we'll send you the recording when it's ready.
Thank you for watching this recorded webinar. Find upcoming webinars to register for at libcal.umflint.edu.